Well, welcome to the third webinar of West End Resilience Live. We're here to celebrate the strength and the resilience of the West End and to keep you informed about the trends and the policies that will shape the future of the district. Today, we're going to be hearing from Jacqueline Windsor. She's a partner in the Retail, Leisure and Consumer Strategy Practice at PwC. You can, of course, as always, put your questions to her by clicking on the question mark icon that you should be able to see in your webinar window. From her in a minute, we'll be hearing, but before we welcome her, I'm going to hand over to Jace Tyrrell, Chief Executive at New West End.
Martin, thank you very much indeed, and welcome back, West Enders, our New West End Company members, our partners and our friends who've been able to join us for this third West End Resilience Live. As those that have been with us before, these sessions are all around resilience as we work through this pandemic. So resilience of yourselves, mental and physical well-being, resilience of your West End business, and the third area of resilience, which is the resilience of the West End, which is very much the topic of our session today. The focus of the West End, of course, is our customers today and how resilient they are and will be as we come out through the stages of unlocking here in the UK, but also the months and even years ahead of some pretty significant shifts. This pronounced shift to online, the desire to shop in a more social and environmentally sustainable way. And what does that mean for the West End as we repurpose that? So how do we come out of this current lockdown and a very safe and confident lockdown? And also, what are those big fundamental shifts in customer demand, whether it's our high streets, our luxury boutiques, our international customer, and also our London and UK customer. So very pleased that our partners at PwC were able to join us today and shed some insight on this very important topic for the West End. Thanks, Martin.
Jace, in a moment, I'm going to be introducing Jacqueline Windsor. But before I do that, a reminder that we do want your questions. You can submit them via the webinar window that you're viewing this through right now. All you need to do is click on that question mark icon. So to our guests now, there are few industries more resilient and adaptable to change than retail and leisure. And while COVID-19 has brought with it substantial difficulties to this industry, the latest PwC research shows that consumer sentiment has seen signs of cautious optimism in the last month. This bodes well for businesses looking at their reopening strategies. It's with this in mind that we welcome our guest speaker, Jacqueline Windsor. Jacqueline brings extensive retail experience across a range of business models, including online platforms, department stores, multi-channel specialists and grocers. Jacqueline is going to share some insights on how consumer attitudes and behaviours are evolving at this time. She'll also look at what the longer term implications might be for the retail and leisure sector and how retailers can win when their businesses begin to reopen again. Jacqueline is just joining us by voice today. We won't be seeing her, but I'm sure she has lots of interesting things to tell us. Jacqueline, over to you.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody, and good to meet you virtually. As Martin said, I lead our retail strategy practice for PwC in the UK, and what that means is we help retailers grow in a profitable way. We help investors decide what assets to buy or sell, and equally importantly, most recently, is we help lenders on what financing to provide to retailers, all of which gives me some insights of what's happening on the high street. And for me personally, if I kind of look back, I've been working in this industry for 20 years now. I think it would be fair to say in the last 2 years alone, I think I've seen more disruption, both positive and negative, than I've seen for the previous 20. So turning to the next page, I think we would all be forgiven if we just read the headlines that we might think retail was dying. I think before COVID, it was tough. I mean, all the retail metrics were going the wrong way. Footfall was down, like-for-likes were down, net store closures were up. And now in a post-COVID world, I think we're going to have to navigate some big changes in how consumers shop. And this actually makes for a really tough retail equation if you turn to the next page. You know, if you look at the top line, you've got a combination of a shrinking wallet for discretionary spend and a competed market. And so that would imply more discounting. And then in parallel, you've got some major cost headwinds. Some we knew about, like GDPR and cybersecurity, and some potentially unknown, like potential pressures to raise a national minimum wage in the spirit of kind of social fairness. You know, when I look back at what my clients have asked me in the last 6 weeks, I think there's some really big questions to both kind of survive, but also to be more sustainable when we start recovery this year, and beyond. And those questions can range from the intangibles, like, you know, how do I make my brand, you know, more purposeful? You know, when people are looking to brands to give them meaning. It also extends to more strategic questions, like actually, how do I innovate my proposition? Whether we're talking product, whether we're talking the role of the store, to some highly practical things like, you know, how are we actually going to fund all this growth when we have a squeeze on liquidity? So what I wanted to do today, if we turn to the next page, is share some insights on 3 things to inform the answers to those questions. I think the first thing that we wanted to touch on is where we are today in terms of the trading environment. Second is what we are learning about consumers from what consumers are telling us. And finally, I think more interestingly, is actually, okay, so what? How are we going to respond to the changes that we are seeing in both consumers and on the high street? So to set the tone in terms of the wider trading environment, if you turn to the next page, we as PwC, no surprises here, have our own economics team who have updated the forecasts of what they're seeing the outlook to look like. And we use this word new normal, and some people have used the word the next normal. And what does that actually mean? I think we're looking at a period of much slower economic growth. And what you can see on this page, oops, I think it's the next page, is our view as in PwC of what is going to be the shape of GDP. And this shows the deviation between what we think is going to happen going forward versus what we expected to happen pre-COVID. So in layman's term, we're looking at a contraction of the economy of 5 to 10%. Okay, and that is the sharpest decline we've seen since World War II. And there's clearly always scenarios around that, a smoother exit or a bumpy exit. And when we look at retail on the next page, it will be disproportionately impacted. So in the short terms, as clearly stores are shut, but also in the longer term, as consumer priorities shift. Okay, sorry, there's a slight lag in the slides. And you can see here, retail highlighted in the middle has been worse affected than, say, financial services or education, telecoms, or pharmaceuticals, but slightly better than our colleagues in hospitality, leisure, aerospace, and construction. Going forward, if you turn to the next page, the retail outlook is at best flattish through to 2021. This chart, when you get to see the slide, shows the quarterly economic forecast. Okay, once we get to the slide, yep, here we go, on a quarterly basis, and you can see that slowish recovery to effectively net neutral. Okay, so that means a severe decline in 2020 and slow, if any, growth beyond 2021 and beyond. And if you turn to the next page, as with any numbers, there's just lots of noise around the average. And what this shows is the retail sector variation in terms of market outlook. So when we break things like food and non-food, again, no surprises here, food doing very well and non-food not doing well, which is what you can see at the top. The red bubble is pre-COVID versus the pink bubble is what we're expecting now. And you can see that variation by sector. I think what is really more shocking is the sector variation for non-food, with clothing at the far left to some categories that fare a little bit better, like electronics. And looking at so much data, there's just really one simple takeaway for the many retailers in the West End on this call. You effectively can't rely on market for growth. You will need to simply take share from somebody else. So you need to be clear, one, who you need to beat, but also two, how you're going to do that. And this concept of guerrilla warfare, I think, is quite relevant. And I use those kind of words purposely. So what do we mean by guerrilla? We mean a little bit dirty, a little bit more innovative, a little bit more different than what the established norms have been. And warfare meaning you need to battle for the share of consumer wallet. So then looking at what are we learning from consumers? So at PwC, as we turn to the next page and the page after that, I wanted to kind of set the tone after a very subdued trading environment update on how consumers are actually thinking about the way they shop. And what we do at PwC is we pretty much keep a regular pulse on what consumers are feeling across the UK. And the very first question we always ask them, which is on the next page, is how do you feel about your disposable income? And why is that important? It's because it's a very good lead indicator on future spending. So what this chart shows is that people who are positive about their income are above the line, people who are negative below the line, and the solid line is the net sentiment. So as you can see, this, is there some cautious optimism, as we said, in April after quite a disaster in March. And we can quite simply explain that as lockdown was enforced on March 23rd, people's sentiment crashed, but then as government funding packages were announced, they felt a little bit better. But I think it's worth looking at a longer time horizon that relatively it's still much better than the last recession in 2008 and 9, more of the austerity years in 2011 and 12. And looking at this page now, there's clearly variation by age and by socio-demographic group. So the top graph is age and the bottom is socio-demographic group. And this shape, i.e. youngers tend to be a little bit more optimistic than the older cohorts, or more affluent people tend to be more optimistic than less affluent, always exists no matter when you take the pulse check. And you can argue that younger people haven't lived through, say, maybe a recession, so they don't know any better, or it might be because they tend to be lower paid workers and therefore will benefit more from government schemes. In contrast, you might look at the older people whose pensions might be hit and therefore feeling less optimistic. And the simple takeaway here is really understanding who your target consumer is and actually how they're feeling. If you turn to the next page, if people are feeling somewhat subdued about their disposable situation, how are they navigating their personal finances? I think they're adopting kind of a mix of measures, which simply could be summarized as people are going to take out some credit, they're going to save a little bit more, pay off their mortgage, and they might do some deal hunting in terms of switching to kind of manage their wallet. What does that mean for people on the high street who are selling discretionary goods? Well, simply, there's going to be less allocated to that bucket. So really reinforcing the share perspective. Okay, so I think the next two slides, if we turn to the next page, is looking at it from a behavioral perspective. So the next question we typically ask consumers after we see about how they feel about their income is, okay, how is your behavior changing? Both in terms of how your behavior is changing today, i.e. during recession or during COVID, but also how you intend to change your behavior going forward. Okay, so looking at this chart, the x-axis is the percentage of people who are saying they're doing it now, and the y-axis is the percentage of people who are going to change going forward. And this is for the last recession. And why am I showing the last recession? I think the last recession shows us some good lessons about what we call sticky behavior, i.e. behavior that consumers adopt in the recession tend to stick, or some tend to stick after the recession. So as illustration, if you look at the bottom gray bubble, there are some things people might do if they don't have much money. They simply buy less. How do you buy less? You stop buying, you might buy smaller items, you might buy less items. But that kind of behavior tends to revert when things get a little bit better. The two bubbles on the top are relatively sticky, i.e., I'm doing some of those things now, and hey, I'm used to it, so I'm going to do it even on recovery. And what we generally found in the last recession was consumers became a lot more promiscuous. They were much more promiscuous about brands they bought and about retailers they bought from, i.e., they were very happy to shop high-low. If you turn to the next page, what is happening in COVID? So same questions. What are you doing now, and what do you tend to do going forward? This time round, the trigger is lockdown. In the recession, the trigger was less money. So what are people doing in lockdown? What we're seeing is what we're calling forced experimentation. Because you're locked in your home, people are turning to digital solutions to not just buy stuff, but to socialize, to be entertained, to get fit. So let's bring that to life. If you look at the gray bubble on the bottom, there's definitely people are experimenting with stuff they haven't done before. So are you buying more online in categories that just traditionally had low online penetration, like personal care? Are you actually buying more from brands who are actively supporting NHS and vulnerable people? Are you deciding to rent fitness equipment because you actually can't go to the gym? But are those kind of behaviors likely to flip back in the recovery? I think much more interesting is what's happening in the pink bubbles. So sticky behavior on the far right, by definition, because people are doing it now and they plan to do it going forward, but also some evolving behavior on the left-hand side. So for example, as we work from home, as we school our kids from home, you're using more services online, whether it's education, whether it's socializing, whether it's live streaming event. And I think this really gives permission to retailers to figure out how do they engage and sell to consumers in the new world. So that then leads us on to the next section, which is fine. How do we respond to these changes in consumer behavior and attitudes, recognizing it's a battle for share of wallet? And I wanted to suggest, as opposed to answer all the questions of what you wanted to do, some of the things that I think people should absolutely consider. And if I had to summarize that on the next page, it would be 3 ideas for you to reflect on. One is about embedding resilience for any next black swan event, whether it's a pandemic, whether it's a financial crisis, or indeed a supply side shock. Second is about capitalizing on trends that we have seen accelerated during COVID, some of which I've already talked about. And third is really encouraging retailers to think about new models to engage customers, new models to partner with people, and new models to actually drive different ways to make money. Wanted to bring some of those to life if we turn to the next page. So, embedding resilience. Resilience is the title of this presentation, right? Are we resilient as a sector, and are we as people resilient in lockdowns? I think we need to take the lessons on resilience today and actually embed it on how we manage our organizations. And lots of people have come out to say they have positively surprised themselves. So Tesco, for example, launching new initiatives in much shorter timeframes than they have done historically. And M&S saying they have pivoted non-food people to support the food side of the business. So how do we think about resilience? The other concept I love is the concept of right sizing. I think right sizing can be interpreted simply as, let's just take some cost out. And we in COVID have had to take costs out, whether it is rationalizing our people or rationalizing our store estate. I think a better way to think about right sizing is the concept of kind of good and bad costs. Is actually looking at your cost base and being more strategic about what can be cut to be reallocated to costs that actually drive differentiation and money. So things typically associated with customer-facing activities as versus the back office, or things that are associated with your core competencies, whether that's omnichannel or whether that's a branding position. The second theme is around new trends. If we turn to the next page, I think there's some really interesting kind of polarized trends. I think online is, again, no surprises. So digital solutions clearly is something that has come to the fore in a lockdown. But I think the parallel trend that's happening is localization, right? So people, if they go out, are looking at local destinations to serve their needs, both in terms of convenience, like food, but in terms of safety, like pharmacy, but also in terms of social engagement, like food banks. So, what do we want to think about as the role of a local destination going forward? And our consumers are telling us more will buy from local and more will buy from smaller businesses. The other interesting trend is what we're calling kind of low contact commerce. So in COVID, ATMs and I think petrol stations are two common ways to transmit the virus. So that has encourage people to use cashless payment systems. So should we be thinking about payment solutions as the same way as we're thinking about logistics solutions, as a source of differentiation as opposed to just a cost? And finally, I wanted to think about brands. I think brands is always an intangible, and working with investors, we're always challenged to figure out how do you quantify the value of brand. And I think in times of crisis, brands with purpose are actually going up the radar for consumers, and they are actively telling us they will buy more from brands that support the NHS and vulnerable people. They will buy more from brands that take care of their staff. So is this a really good time to think about your brand purpose beyond making money? What is relevant for your consumers? Can you take transparent actions against it, and can you measure it? So I think brands is a way to think about the wider business model. And then finally, just to round off this discussion about innovation, I think it's really exciting right now to see what people are experimenting with from a business model perspective. And the three ways I've seen more prominently is customer engagement, partnerships across the value chain as opposed to collaborations alone in terms of product, and new ways to make money. So, for example, customer engagement. What we've seen more in COVID is much more direct comms, actually using more traditional mechanisms like emails that are coming direct from CEOs to your customers on explaining what they're doing and how they're supporting communities in the crisis. The other thing I think that people are doing is what I call assisted sales. How to use personal stylists or other digital solutions to help consumer navigate purchase decisions, and also how do you connect consumer to consumer. Partnerships is quite an interesting one. I mean, clearly partnerships have existed forever, but what we've seen more is more active propositions in the back office. So really looking at shared capabilities and platforms to beat some of the established online players. And I think this will really drive different e-commerce ecosystems that are more open than closed. And actually, how do smaller retailers use that as an opportunity to beat some of the big players? And then finally, new ways to make money. I think there is some really interesting consumer dynamics here that have actually existed outside of COVID. So when we think about things like access, not ownership, when we think about circular models versus linear models, does that support new ways to make money as opposed to selling new product alone? Is that subscription models? Is that rental and resale? Is that actually looking more at marketplaces as a way to complement your own stores? And I'm not saying that anyone alone will plug the gap in terms of the value that has been destroyed over the last couple of years. What I am saying is that we want to give consumers choice. We want to give consumers choice on how they can access the brands. So to close, I think it's a really tough environment. I think tough times can also be a great platform for innovation. And why am I excited about retail? I think there are a number of things that the retail of tomorrow would tell us about the retail today. So looking at those trends, I think we used to live in a world where it was all about pushing product. I think we are now moving into a world where we have to listen to what consumers want and refine the product, the packaging, and the channel of which they want to consume them. I think we're moving from a world where, say, you were in clothing, you had 2 main seasons and 2 transitional seasons. We're moving to a world where people want to see innovation all the time, so weekly drops. We are moving from a world where we talked about single channels to multiple channels to omni-channel. We're moving to a world where I think channels is actually a redundant world. Consumers want to research, transact, and get their purchases fulfilled across any way they want to. I think it will move from a world that is mass to more personalized, and I'm not necessarily talking to one-on-one, but actually really driving a proposition that resonates with a tribe. I think we're already moving our world from e-commerce to m-commerce and soon to be social commerce. And I say social commerce with a small s. It's not just about social media. It is about how do we use community as a way to generate sales. We are certainly moving away from a linear economy where we make stuff, we buy stuff, and then we dump stuff, to a world where we can actually create a more circular economy with resale and rental. And we're certainly moving away from a win-win, I need to be one player, to something where we can actually work in partnership with others. So if I had to sum it up, having been in this industry for 20 years, I was always taught that I sit in the retail sector. It was about 4 levers. It was about product, pricing, promotions, and place. And it was really a transactional way to think about the world. I think we're absolutely on a journey that we're moving to a world where it's all about brands. Brands that have an ethos that consumers can connect to. It is about an experience that consumers can have, whether they're buying a product from you or not. And that really reflects a convergence of sectors, whether that's retail, leisure, consumer finance, content, and tech. And that is the single reason why I'm still excited about retail and why I believe retail is resilient. So thank you for listening. And I hope that creates a little bit of food for thought on how we can win going forward.
It certainly does, Jacqueline. Thank you very much indeed for that presentation. We'll be turning to Q&A in just a moment. Just before we do turn to Q&A, a reminder, we do want to hear your questions. I know that there's a number coming through already, but just to remind you, all you need to do, click on that little question mark icon, which should be on your webinar window. I know everyone's windows are slightly different, but I think it's down towards the bottom, and then type away your question. Then we'll put it to Jacqueline. Let's have a look at one here from Peter Wetherall. Will retail in the West End handle click and collect? I'm not sure if that's a question for you or for the retailers, but do you have a view on that, Jacqueline?
Yeah, I think it goes back to how we think about the end-to-end customer journey. So I think simply, the customer journey is about inspiring them, enabling them to research, getting them to transact, fulfill, and engage. And click and collect is one mechanism that can support that journey. So I see that as just another choice that we have to give consumers, because they may, for example, want to be inspired and research online, but actually pick up in store. And so I think we need to increase proportion of that. The other thing, of course, retailers will benefit is the halo effect, because they might click and collect and then do an impulse purchase when they do that collection.
This wasn't really covered, I don't think, in your presentation, but obviously one of the big issues which is preoccupying everybody is that when the formal part of the lockdown is revised, we will perhaps still be required to socially distance still, certainly more than we ordinarily would, and we won't be going back completely to normal. Have you had any thoughts about how that could be managed in terms of the West End and within stores, and how that could work?
In terms of retail ops?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's there's already some lessons, particularly from the grocers, because they've had to navigate the highest footfall. And you can see some of the teething problems with that. Everything from not just protecting customers, but actually protecting their staff, whether it's controlled hours, whether it's controlled traffic, supporting different customer segments, i.e. vulnerable people, maybe early doors. It is about in-store signage to remind people to social distance, and creating some other mechanisms where you don't have to shop in store, but you can collect in store. So things like the DIY retailers like B&Q, et cetera, that have recently opened up. So I think there's already lessons to be learned from the retailers who are allowed to operate today.
I'm sure you are aware that over 50% of the spending in the West End is actually from overseas visitors. This is actually a question from Anna. Do you think that those overseas spenders, visitors, customers to the West End, are they thinking the same kind of things that you've been articulating here, or were you really articulating the view of the UK domestic customer?
I was talking about the UK customer, but I think China, because it's coming out earlier, actually will have some relevant lessons, recognizing there's clearly going to be some geographic differences as well. And what you could see from the Chinese is that there was latent demand for buying things, right? They wanted to shop, but they didn't necessarily want to dine and go to restaurants or other entertainment or leisure destinations. So shopping was a priority versus entertainment and leisure. And I think Hermes, as a factoid, had the biggest selling day, when stores were allowed to open. But that doesn't mean that some of the things that we're seeing in the UK won't apply in terms of managing footfall. So I think it really depends on the category that you're in, but also what demand might look like for your specific store.
Okay, question here from both Carlos and someone who's remaining anonymous. They're both making the point about companies, retailers that support the NHS. And the question is basically, do you think that improved customer spending through businesses that support the NHS will be a consistent behaviour post-COVID, or do you believe that once the dust has settled, consumer sentiment will return to normal?
What I think will stick is that a brand's contribution to its staff, consumers, and wider community will absolutely stay relevant. How that manifests itself, whether it's NHS now versus other sources of community need going forward, I think it will be the difference. It may not be the NHS, but I think brand purpose will absolutely be one of the increasing purchase criteria consumers will consider. It won't be the biggest one, but it will be a top 3 to top 5.
Question here from Anna: how much is COVID-19 accelerating a change in consumer sentiment that we're already seeing on environmental issues? Are we heading for kinder consumer?
Yeah. It's the consumer data shows less so. Although I think when you think about environmental and ethics, it often gets lumped together. So when we think about purpose, how do we give back? It could be the environment versus people, community. So if you look at Patagonia, how they're interpreting COVID right now is in a slightly different way than how other retailers are doing it. So I think if you can define purpose that is actually authentic to you, I think environment could be valid. What is interesting, though, is we did a lot of research historically around sustainability and whether that is a driver of purchase decisions. And what we found was that you can't command a premium for sustainability outside a limited tribe. But all things being equal, they will choose the brand that's more sustainable.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
It does. A question here from James, kind of touching on what we were talking about before in terms of social distancing in retail, but I'm going to put it to you just in case it brings out and draws out another strand of thought. The question is, how will business models based on mass sales manage to survive under social distancing rules?
Yeah, I think it's I don't know, to be honest. I mean, I look at restaurants and, if you have to have 6 feet between, either tables or people who are sitting at a table, but you need to have a minimum number of covers to be economically viable. I understand the question, how do you actually make money? Now, if it's a profitability question, a viability question, do you actually have to supplement physical purchases with digital, right? So do you have to use more of an omni-channel approach to be viable? I.e., do you, channel click and collect in a certain way as opposed to the full store? Do you have digital tablets to, make the transactions? How do you actually optimize the footfall in store and online so the equation works?
Okay, interesting question here. From someone who's wishing to remain anonymous, do you think the West End will behave differently or buck the trend in terms of speed, rate of recovery versus the general UK high street?
I do, for a number of reasons. One is sentiment in London is relatively better than most other regions. So I think that bodes well for the West End. I think, secondly, that luxury and premium have rebounded, and value, as opposed to the kind of the middle, have rebounded faster than the mass market. And in the West End, that's disproportionate of the former. So I think that bodes for the West End. I think the issue is tourism. And that is not necessarily linked to what people want to travel, is whether people can travel, and looking at what government policies will be in terms of movement is going to drive, I think, the bigger impact for some of the retailers in the West End. When you look at the luxury department stores where 20% of their sales is due to China, that is going to be a problem.
Okay, another one here from another James. I think it's a different James, but this is the question. The lockdown has brought a renewed focus on sustainability and corporate responsibility in the retail sector. But with the current added pressures on profitability, will retailers' sustainable and CSR initiatives be sidelined?
I think that would be quite a reactive way. So it goes back to the concept of what I was talking about, right sizing. And it isn't that just about taking cost out alone, but it's allocating some costs to the costs that actually make a difference to your consumers and therefore your bottom line. And I think that is the exercise that people need to do more strategically. If CSR is important to your customers, you've got to find a way to fund it. Whether it's taking costs out and moving it to other buckets or optimizing your non-core costs. And I think that is one of the bigger takeouts I hope that people got from this session.
Good point here from Zach, and a question from Zach. We are planning for reopening, and it's really showing how interrelated everything is. We retailers can come up with reopenings that will keep customers safe and make them feel comfortable and confident. But what about public transport, for example? If people aren't comfortable on the tube, we have no customers. How should we integrate more the different elements post COVID-19?
I was trying to say beyond my pay grade.
Go on, have a go. I'm sure the government is listening to us right now, and they're hanging on your word, and I'm sure you have some thoughts.
Again, I think the government has to find a way to phase the recovery of the economy while still protecting the NHS, right? It will not be open all doors. So how do we manage transport to get the economy back up, right? So is it about controlled hours and controlled footfall for transportation links to get people into the West End? Would be a simple, I guess, response. But I think can we be creative, on the supply side to encourage other people to get to us? So, for example, bicycles or walking destination, whatever, to make it more of a leisure destination activity as opposed to this is the way I can buy a certain product. I mean, the streets are empty, right? And so is there a way to, use that as an opportunity to encourage consumers to take it as a leisure, and actually working together with other retailers to organize that flow.
Okay, I'm going to bring in Jace actually, because I think that Jace has a couple of thoughts. Jace, particularly on the transport side, what's your thinking?
Well, I think it sort of is in our pay grade at New West End, because it's exactly where we've been thinking the last couple of weeks. What are the ingredients of the public transport, the physical space of the West End streets and the businesses? And exactly right, how do we get that balance right for safety, first of all, for staff and customers coming back, but equally customers, we can do that in a safe way, and thinking about the amount of space we have and repurposing that space for this very challenge of obviously customers coming back. Very live conversations with the Mayor's Office and Transport for London, particularly challenging for transport and public transport, because if they're going to have to follow guidelines, it's going to be very difficult to get the capacity and demand. So I think, as Jacqueline was saying, rethinking how people access both customers and staff. You know, bicycles, it could be a summer where we're encouraging all of our customers to cycle in to the West End, and how we make provisions for that, turning a lot of the road traffic space into pedestrian space. Very live conversations now on that. So really good thinking, and I'm sure we're going to come back to this in the next couple of weeks as our plans shape up to really make it as safe, but also try and drive some profit and revenue back into the West End over the next 6 months is going to be critically important for all of our members.
Jace, isn't the reality as well that different people have different attitudes towards the whole COVID-19 threat? And there will be many people who, as soon as the lockdown is partially lifted or there's a revision of it, will be straight out onto Oxford Street and all the surrounding streets. They won't need any encouragement.
Let's hope so, but I think this is an extraordinary time, whether it's Bond, Oxford or Regent Street and our whole neighbourhood. I mean, we've seen different characteristics of people around the world as they start to come out of lockdown. And I think, as Jacqueline says, luxury sector might be very different to premium versus high street. But I think the most important thing for us at this point is to get a safe and confident reopening for the staff and customers, and really get that right, because that will set the tone and the response over the coming months ahead.
Jacqueline, there's a question here from someone who is remaining anonymous, but a good point. Many retailers have been successful in selling goods from home via assisted selling. How can retailers leverage the increased use of this service in the future to drive traffic to physical stores?
Yeah, I think people are using digital to bring forward sales, or at least set them up themselves for sales. So what do I mean by that? So for example, you know, whether it's using virtual reality to create an in-store experience, whether it's using live personal stylists to navigate choices, I think there are ways to digitally enhance that experience to encourage people to go to store, or actually to use it as a store substitute to drive traffic to stores going forward. So I think people are experimenting, and it's not just retailers. I think it's also like casual dining restaurants who are doing virtual dining until, you know, doors open. So I think you can use the digital channels to encourage store visits going forward.
Question here from another person who's remaining anonymous. What companies will come out of this strongest when the market recovers?
So I can't name names at the risk of client confidentiality, etc. But I think if you ask me, how do I see retail shaping up, and therefore what are the winning and winning business models within that? I see kind of two ecosystems. One is going to be a convenience ecosystem, which is all going to be driven by platforms. So the Amazon-like solutions of the world. Okay. The second is much more a destination that is more localized, that goes beyond retail. It could be shopping, it could be leisure, it indeed could be working and residential. So those are kind of the two worlds I see, and where physical clearly has a space is the latter, and as a way to kind of connect lots of different parts in that ecosystem. So therefore, what would be the winning brand in that kind of model? I think it is lifestyle brands. So brands we turn to because they mean something in my life as opposed to just the products that they sell. And clearly there's a number of that in the premium and luxury segment. I think it will be about things we want to treat ourselves with that is more of an investment, and that could be lend itself to luxury. And I think it will be other solutions we might have for our wider network, i.e. Families, etc. I think that will be a winning model. And then the fourth winning model would be things that are more experience-led, that are supported by product. And this is because we're shifting our spend from pure product to things around experiences. But what do experience require sometimes is stuff. So things that we are really enthusiastic about, it could be, I don't know, bicycles. It could be some other passion that we might have, but I think those will be a winning model going forward. And we can all think of brands that kind of fit into those buckets.
Question here from Rachel. How do you foresee luxury retailers managing customer experience in store post COVID-19? There will obviously be elements lifted from essential stores, but how do you think they might elevate this to maintain a fluid brand experience whilst keeping customers, consumers safe?
So it's a very similar question again, or is this specific to luxury?
Specific to luxury. It's a tough one. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no, luxury is quite interesting because the concept of luxury by definition is exclusivity. Okay, and it might be because there's heritage in there. It might be because of a great creative, but by definition, it's exclusive. And I think there are some luxury brands, Gucci being probably a really good example, given its popularity on social media, et cetera, which actually combine both digital and human touch points to create a reason to buy from them. And that's where the role of the store is equally as important as their digital and social channels. So, you know, I think luxury has lots of ways they can to create a great in-store experience that supports exclusivity. Everything from the way they merchandise to the experiences that they provide in store, whether that's your personal, but also whether it's your events that have nothing to do with the product itself.
Question here, talking of luxury, from Matt Shields, Watches of Switzerland. What are you learning from cities in Asia and Europe that are emerging from lockdown?
I think we have focused on China because it's coming out earlier, and I appreciate there's some smaller markets that are behaving a little bit different in Europe, but I don't have a lot of visibility on that. I think we've been watching at China because they're about a month ahead of us. And as I said, I think they are cautiously optimistic as a Chinese consumer base, where they are shopping but not going out for entertainment. But there is a lot of latent demand that wasn't serviced during COVID, and that is definitely coming to its fore. I think they have some sticky behavior as well. They clearly are quite ahead of us on the way they use digital and social media applications, so that is quite different. But in terms of accessing services is what's different among the Chinese consumers, which I think has relevance for us here. Services as in standalone services that you can make money from, but also services that support product.
Okay, question here for someone who is remaining anonymous, but we'll put the question to you. What are your views on how retail businesses may react to potential business rates reform and the impact this may have on online businesses if it levels the playing field versus bricks and mortar?
Yeah, I don't have specific comment on that. I do think, though, it is associated with how we think about e-commerce ecosystem, about the level playing field. Are there other ways to level the playing field if we want to, you know, beat the likes of Amazon, right? And actually, can we use partnership collaborations or indeed M&A to be able to create our own ecosystem to level that playing field, or actually to compete better?
Okay, I think we've got time for one last question, and then we'll probably be wrapping things after that. And the question is, have you heard of any cost relaxation for travel in or out of London for domestic customers to attract more people from out of London?
No, not personally.
Do you think there should be?
I think, I think it's going to be phased, and that I don't actually think that's the first priority. I think the first priority is actually how do you optimize traffic in the neighborhoods that we have already before we actually start moving people between areas.
Okay,
that's
Jacqueline.
my personal take.
Jacqueline, we really appreciate your time. Thank you very much indeed for joining us today, and to all those who asked questions. If you want to share this webinar with friends or colleagues, it will be available on the New West End YouTube channel and our LinkedIn page. If you have any ideas for guests or subjects that you'd like to hear more on, do please let us know via the usual channels. The next webinar will be on Wednesday, the 6th of May at 4 p.m, the same time, same place, with Laura Citron. Laura is the CEO of London and Partners, the international trade investment and promotion agency for London. She'll share the outlook for London over the coming months and discuss how the city is preparing to transition towards recovery and how businesses in the West End can be part of the citywide effort to kickstart the economy. But for now, thank you for joining us. Goodbye and keep safe.